Who cleared him to sit in on a Delta briefing? The voice cut through the low murmur of the operations room, sharp enough to turn heads without being raised, and Captain Jason Mercer didn't bother hiding the irritation in his tone as he stepped inside, boots quiet against the polished concrete floor, his eyes already scanning the rows of operators gathered beneath the muted glow of overhead lights, each man focused, disciplined, and unmistakably Delta, except for one figure seated alone at the far end of the table, an elderly man in a faded brown jacket, hands folded loosely in front of him, posture relaxed in a room where tension usually lived in every breath, and Mercer stopped for half a second, the subtle pause enough for the rest of the room to notice, because Delta briefings did not include strangers, and they certainly didn't include quiet old men who looked like they had wandered in from a veterans' hall across town. No one answered Mercer immediately, and that silence only sharpened his expression as he moved forward, the faint hum of the air conditioning filling the space while a digital map flickered on the wall behind them, classified markers glowing faintly in red and amber, details that never appeared in rooms with unauthorized personnel, and yet the old man didn't look at the map, didn't look at Mercer, didn't look at anyone. His gaze steady on the tabletop as if he'd already seen rooms like this long before most of the operators here had graduated high school. Mercer stopped beside the chair nearest him and folded his arms, studying the man more closely now, noticing the weathered lines along his face, the calm in his pale blue eyes, and the stillness that didn't match someone out of place. But Mercer had seen calm before, and he'd also seen civilians try to look calm when they weren't supposed to be there. "Sir," Mercer said, the word polite but stripped of warmth, "this is a restricted briefing," and a few operators shifted slightly, glancing between the two, sensing the quiet friction building. The old man lifted his eyes slowly, not hurried, not defensive, just deliberate, and there was something about the way he looked at Mercer that felt less like acknowledgement and more like quiet measurement. "I was told to wait here," the old man said, his voice low, steady, and unexpectedly firm, and Mercer felt the faintest tightening in his jaw because it wasn't the answer he expected, and it wasn't delivered like someone asking permission. It sounded more like a statement already settled. "By who?" Mercer asked, the question immediate, and the room seemed to lean into the silence that followed. The old man didn't answer right away, and instead his eyes moved briefly toward the closed briefing door, then back to Mercer. "Command," he said simply, and the word hung in the air, too vague to accept, too confident to dismiss. Mercer glanced at the others, searching for recognition, but most faces remained neutral, disciplined, though one or two operators exchanged brief looks, and that was enough to deepen Mercer's suspicion. He stepped closer, noticing a small leather folder resting beside the old man's hand, worn at the edges, the kind of thing that had seen decades of use, and Mercer tapped the table lightly beside it. "You have clearance documentation?" he asked, and again the old man remained calm, his hand resting lightly near the folder but not opening it. "I was told I wouldn't need it," he replied, and that was when a faint ripple of quiet disbelief passed through the room, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable, because Delta operators did not operate on assumptions, and Mercer let out a small breath through his nose, the kind that signaled patience thinning. "Everyone needs clearance," he said, and outside the room, footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway, distant and unhurried, while inside, the tension settled deeper, the digital map behind them shifting slightly as new markers appeared, and the old man sat perfectly still, as if none of it concerned him. As if he had already seen how this moment would unfold, and Mercer noticed something else then, something difficult to define. The old man's presence didn't feel intrusive, it felt grounded, like he belonged to the room in a way that didn't match his appearance, and that quiet contradiction made Mercer narrow his eyes slightly, because in Delta, instincts mattered, and something about this situation wasn't lining up, not yet, and the silence stretched just long enough for the unease to settle in the air like a weight no one wanted to acknowledge. Captain Jason Mercer held the old man's gaze for another second, measuring the calm that did not belong in a room built for precision and urgency, and then he shifted slightly, turning toward the rest of the operators as if expecting someone to clarify the situation, but no one spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to sharpen the tension, and Mercer reached down toward the leather folder resting beside the old man's hand, not touching it yet, only studying the worn edges and faded stitching, the kind of wear that came from decades, not months, and that detail alone felt out of place in a modern Delta briefing room filled with carbon fiber cases and digital tablets. "Sir, I am going to ask you one more time," Mercer said, his voice steady but firm. "Who specifically told you to wait here?" And the old man leaned back slightly in his chair, the movement slow and controlled, like someone who had spent a lifetime conserving motion. "You will know soon enough," he replied. Quietly, and a faint ripple passed across a few faces in the room, not amusement, not frustration, but something closer to curiosity, because the answer sounded less like defiance and more like certainty, and Mercer exhaled slowly, shifting his weight, the overhead lights casting faint reflections across the polished table, while outside the thick reinforced door, the distant hum of activity moved along the corridor, measured and professional. "That is not how this works," Mercer said, and he reached down, tapping lightly on the leather folder again. "If you are cleared, then show it," and for the first time, the old man's eyes dropped to the folder, his fingers brushing the worn surface briefly, as if acknowledging something familiar, but he did not open it. He simply rested his hand there. "I was told not to," he said, and that answer drew a faint shift from Sergeant Luke Bennett seated 2 chairs down, his brow tightening slightly as he studied the old man more closely, because there was something about the way he spoke, not arrogant, not defensive, just grounded, like someone who had already seen the end of the conversation before it began. Mercer noticed Bennett's movement but kept his focus on the old man. "You were told not to show your credentials in a classified Delta briefing," Mercer repeated, the skepticism clear, and the old man nodded once, a small movement, calm and unhurried, and Mercer's expression hardened just slightly, because Delta operated on discipline, not riddles, and yet the old man did not appear uncomfortable, did not shift, did not glance around. He simply remained still, the quiet confidence filling the space in a way that unsettled the rhythm of the room, and Mercer stepped back half a pace, folding his arms again, scanning the operators as if expecting someone to break the tension, but again, no one did. The digital map behind them updated silently, new coordinates blinking into place, and the old man's gaze briefly lifted toward the screen, not studying it, just acknowledging it, like a familiar language, and that small detail did not go unnoticed by Bennett, whose eyes narrowed slightly as a quiet unease settled in his chest, because civilians did not recognize patterns on screens they had never seen before, and Mercer followed Bennett's line of sight for a brief moment before turning back to the old man. "Sir, until we confirm your presence, I am going to ask you to step outside," Mercer said, the request calm but final. And the old man looked up again, his expression unchanged, his eyes steady. "I was told to wait here," he repeated, the same words, delivered with the same calm certainty, and this time the silence that followed felt heavier, deeper, the room holding its breath without anyone realizing it, while somewhere down the hallway, a set of footsteps approached, measured and unhurried, echoing faintly through the corridor as the tension inside the briefing room tightened like a wire pulled just short of snapping. The approaching footsteps grew louder outside the reinforced door, measured and deliberate, and Captain Jason Mercer noticed the subtle shift in posture across the room as several operators instinctively turned their attention toward the sound, because timing like that rarely happened by accident, and the old man did not move, did not glance toward the door. He simply remained seated with his hand resting lightly on the worn leather folder, as if he had been expecting this exact moment, and Mercer caught that detail, the stillness, the quiet certainty, and something in his instincts tightened slightly, not concern, not yet, but a faint awareness that the situation was moving beyond routine protocol. The handle outside turned with a muted click, and the heavy door opened slowly, letting in the cooler air from the hallway, along with the composed presence of a senior officer stepping inside, his uniform precise, his expression calm but focused. Colonel David Harrington paused just inside the doorway, his eyes sweeping the room in a single practice motion, and then they settled immediately on the old man seated at the far end of the table. The pause lasted less than a second, but it was long enough for Sergeant Luke Bennett to notice, and Bennett felt the unease deepen as Harrington moved forward without speaking, the quiet authority in his stride shifting the room's energy almost instantly. Mercer straightened slightly, acknowledging the colonel. "Sir," he said, and Harrington gave a small nod without breaking his focus, his gaze returning to the old man as he crossed the remaining distance. And the silence in the room grew heavier, the faint hum of electronics and distant bass activity fading into the background. Harrington stopped beside the chair, looking down at the old man for a moment, and then something subtle changed in his expression, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition layered with something deeper, respect held carefully beneath discipline. "William Carter," Harrington said quietly, and the old man looked up, meeting his eyes with the same calm that had unsettled Mercer earlier. "Colonel," Carter replied, his voice steady, familiar, and that brief exchange sent a ripple through the room, small but unmistakable. Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied both men. The familiarity in their tone did not match a civilian. Mistakenly entering a classified briefing, Harrington's gaze dropped briefly to the leather folder resting on the table, and he reached for it with deliberate care, his fingers brushing the worn surface, as if handling something known and significant. He lifted it slowly, the aged leather creasing softly under his grip, and Mercer noticed the subtle shift among the operators, the quiet anticipation building. Harrington opened the folder just enough to confirm its contents, his expression tightening for a fraction of a second before he closed it again, and when he looked back up, his voice carried across the room with calm authority. "Captain Mercer," he said, and Mercer stepped forward slightly. "Yes, sir." Harrington held the folder lightly against his side, his eyes steady. "This gentleman is cleared to remain," he said, and Mercer hesitated for a fraction of a second, not questioning, but processing. The simplicity of the statement contrasted sharply with the tension that had built moments earlier. "Understood, sir," Mercer replied, though the uncertainty remained beneath his composed tone. Harrington gave a small nod and then turned slightly, addressing the room as a whole. "Proceed with the briefing," he said, but he did not step away immediately. Instead his gaze returned once more to Carter, and the quiet exchange between them lingered unspoken. Bennett noticed the subtle respect in the colonel's posture, the slight shift that rarely appeared around anyone outside the chain of command, and that detail settled deeper into his instincts, because in Delta, respect like that was earned slowly, and rarely given without reason. And as the digital map behind them updated again, the room resumed motion, but the atmosphere had changed. The quiet presence at the end of the table no longer felt out of place, it felt like something waiting to be understood. Colonel David Harrington stepped aside as the digital display shifted to a more detailed operational map, the faint glow reflecting across the polished surface of the table while Captain Jason Mercer began outlining the mission parameters, his voice steady and controlled, but the rhythm of the room had changed. And everyone could feel it. The quiet presence of William Carter now carried weight that had not existed minutes earlier. Mercer gestured toward a series of terrain overlays, elevation data stretching across the screen in muted layers of gray and amber. Target area sits at roughly 4,200 feet above sea level, with narrow access routes along the northern ridge, he explained, and several operators leaned forward slightly, studying the data, but Carter's eyes lifted briefly toward the screen, not scanning like someone learning, but observing like someone remembering, and Sergeant Luke Bennett noticed the subtle shift in Carter's expression, the faint narrowing of his eyes, as if the terrain itself held familiarity. Mercer continued, outlining weather patterns and expected wind conditions. "Forecast shows crosswinds around 12 to 15 miles per hour by late afternoon," he added, and Carter's gaze moved again, this time toward a specific section of the map, a narrow valley marked by shaded contours, his fingers tapping lightly once against the table, not interrupting, just acknowledging something unseen. Bennett followed Carter's line of sight and studied the same area, noticing nothing unusual at first glance, but the old man's quiet attention made the detail linger longer than it otherwise would have. Mercer advanced the briefing, pointing toward extraction timing. "Primary window is 15 minutes before sunset," he said, and Carter's voice came quietly, not interrupting, but clear enough to reach the far end of the table. "You will want to adjust that by 10 minutes. The room went still, not abruptly, but with a subtle pause that spread from one operator to another. Mercer turned slowly toward Carter, his expression controlled but unmistakably surprised. "Based on what, sir?" Mercer asked, and Carter's eyes remained calm, steady. "Thermal shifts along that valley," he said, nodding slightly toward the map. "The wind changes earlier than forecast once the temperature drops along the ridge." Mercer studied the map again, his instincts weighing the comment, and Bennett felt the quiet tension return, because Carter had spoken with certainty, not speculation. Mercer glanced toward the meteorological data on the screen, then back to Carter. "Weather models account for that," Mercer replied, and Carter gave a small nod, not dismissive, simply calm. "Models do not always see what terrain remembers," he said, and the word settled into the room with quiet weight. Bennett felt a faint chill of recognition, because Carter was not guessing, he was recalling. Mercer hesitated for a brief second, then continued the briefing, but the moment lingered, the subtle shift in authority barely noticeable but deeply felt. Colonel Harrington watched quietly from the side of the room, his expression unreadable, yet there was a faint hint of acknowledgement in his eyes, as if the exchange confirmed something he already knew. Mercer finished outlining the operational timeline, though his attention returned briefly to Carter more than once, and the operators around the table resumed their focused posture, but the quiet respect had begun to form, subtle and unspoken, and Bennett noticed that even the smallest movements around Carter now carried awareness, as if the room had adjusted to his presence without anyone consciously deciding to do so. The digital map dimmed slightly as the briefing paused, and Carter leaned back in his chair once more, hands resting calmly, the same quiet composure returning, but the difference now was unmistakable. The old man at the end of the table was no longer just a question, he had become something else entirely, something that shifted the gravity of the room without raising his voice. The room remained quiet for a moment after William Carter leaned back in his chair, the subtle shift in atmosphere lingering like a pressure change no one openly acknowledged, and Captain Jason Mercer moved to continue the briefing, though his eyes drifted once more toward the terrain display, reconsidering the valley Carter had mentioned, the elevation lines forming a narrow funnel between two ridges that looked ordinary at first glance. Yet Mercer adjusted the overlay slightly, adding wind projection models, and the data flickered across the screen, showing small variations that were easy to dismiss but no longer easy to ignore. Sergeant Luke Bennett watched the adjustment carefully, noticing how Mercer's posture had shifted from authority to analysis, and that alone spoke volumes, because Delta leaders rarely reconsidered assumptions without reason. Mercer studied the data for another few seconds, then nodded slightly, not openly acknowledging Carter, but quietly updating the extraction timing by 10 minutes. And the change appeared on the display without comment. Carter did not react, his gaze remaining calm and distant, as if the adjustment had already been expected. Colonel David Harrington observed the exchange silently, his hands resting behind his back, the faintest hint of approval in his expression before it returned to neutral discipline. Mercer resumed outlining the final approach routes, though the operators now listened with a slightly deeper focus, their attention occasionally drifting toward Carter without conscious intent, because experience in that room was measured not by rank but by instinct, and Carter's quiet presence carried both. Mercer reached the final slide of the briefing and paused, allowing the team to absorb the operational timeline, the faint hum of the projector filling the silence, and Bennett noticed Carter's eyes shift again, this time toward a secondary route marked along a narrow ridge line, the old man's gaze resting there for just a moment longer than before, and Bennett followed the same line, noticing how the ridge curved sharply before descending into the valley, a detail easy to overlook but tactically meaningful. Carter's fingers moved slightly, tapping once against the table, the same quiet gesture from earlier, and Bennett felt the unease deepen, not discomfort, but recognition of experience. Mercer turned toward the team. "Any questions?" he asked, and the operators remained silent, their focus disciplined. Carter spoke again, his voice calm and measured. "That ridge will create shadow pockets earlier than expected," he said, nodding toward the route. "You will want to adjust your approach timing by at least 5 minutes. Mercer looked toward the ridge, studying the terrain again, and Bennett watched the exchange carefully, the room holding its breath once more. Mercer zoomed in on the map, the contour line sharpening, and after a few seconds, he nodded slightly, updating the timeline once more, the adjustment appearing quietly on the display. Carter gave a small nod, then leaned back again, returning to stillness, and the shift in the room deepened further, because the second adjustment confirmed what instincts had already begun to tell them. This quiet old man understood terrain like someone who had lived inside it. Colonel Harrington stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "We will proceed with the updated plan," he said, and Mercer acknowledged with a nod, the team absorbing the changes without question, because Delta trusted competence, regardless of where it came from. Bennett noticed how even the most seasoned operators now glanced toward Carter with quiet respect, not curiosity anymore, but recognition. The digital display dimmed as the briefing concluded, and Carter remained seated, calm and composed, his presence no longer uncertain but quietly influential, and Mercer, gathering his notes, paused for just a second longer than necessary, his eyes moving toward Carter once more, as if recalibrating something unspoken. The room began to shift into motion, chairs sliding softly, equipment cases closing, but the gravity of Carter's presence remained, subtle and undeniable, like a quiet center forming in the room that had not existed before. The briefing room gradually shifted into controlled movement as operators gathered tablets and reviewed updated timing markers, the low sound of equipment cases closing blending with the distant hum of the base beyond the reinforced walls, and William Carter remained seated at the end of the table, hands resting lightly on the worn leather folder, his posture relaxed yet attentive, as if the mission had already settled into place in his mind. Captain Jason Mercer moved along the table, exchanging brief confirmations with his team, but his focus drifted again toward Carter, not out of suspicion anymore, but out of quiet recalibration, because 2 adjustments based purely on observation had changed the operational flow, and that carried weight in a Delta room. Sergeant Luke Bennett lingered near the digital display, studying the terrain overlays one more time, his eyes moving between the ridge and the valley Carter had identified, and the more he examined the contours, the more the logic surfaced, the way shadow would form along the slopes, the way wind currents could shift unpredictably between elevation changes, details that were subtle yet significant, and Bennett felt a growing certainty that Carter was not analyzing data, he was remembering terrain. Colonel David Harrington stepped closer to Carter, his voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. "It has been a long time," he said quietly, and Carter gave a small nod, his expression calm. "Terrain does not change as much as people think," he replied, and Harrington's lips tightened slightly in what almost looked like a restrained smile before returning to neutral. Mercer noticed the exchange, and something about the familiarity between them reinforced the quiet respect forming in the room. Bennett shifted slightly, then moved toward a side console, his instincts guiding him more than curiosity. He opened a secondary system interface, entering Carter's name carefully, not out of doubt, but out of a growing sense that understanding the old man mattered. The system paused for a fraction of a second longer than expected, then displayed a restricted access notification. Bennett leaned back slightly, surprised. Because the base network rarely delayed without reason, he attempted a broader search, and again the system responded with limited clearance restrictions, a subtle indication that the information existed but was protected. Bennett glanced toward Harrington and Carter, the quiet realization settling deeper, because restricted files were not uncommon, but the level of clearance implied something beyond routine service history. Mercer gathered the final documents and turned back toward the room. "Final checks in 10 minutes, he said calmly, and the operators acknowledged with quiet nods. Carter rose slowly from his chair, the movement deliberate, steady, and as he stood, Bennett noticed the quiet confidence in his posture, not rigid like a formal stance, but grounded like someone who had stood in briefing rooms long before digital maps replaced paper charts. Carter picked up the leather folder, holding it lightly at his side, and Harrington stepped aside slightly, allowing him space without needing to say anything. Mercer watched the interaction, the subtle respect between them becoming clearer. The room continued shifting into operational readiness, but the atmosphere remained different, quieter, more focused, and Bennett felt the weight of the moment settle, because the old man who had entered the room as a question had now become something else entirely, a presence that shaped decisions without demanding authority. And as Carter moved toward the far side of the room, his eyes briefly returned to the terrain display one last time, a small nod following, as if confirming something only he could see. And the quiet certainty of that gesture lingered in the air long after he turned away. Sergeant Luke Bennett remained at the side console, the faint glow of the restricted access notice still reflecting across the screen, and he glanced once more toward William Carter, who now stood quietly near the far wall, holding the worn leather folder as if it weighed nothing. Yet Bennett could not shake the feeling that whatever rested inside carried decades of history. He shifted slightly and attempted one more search, this time using a legacy archive filter that rarely returned results. The system paused longer than before, the cursor blinking steadily while the room around him filled with the quiet sounds of final preparation, and then a small notification appeared, partial clearance only, limited metadata. Bennett leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as a single line surfaced, operational advisory designation, classified support authority. The rest of the file remained locked behind higher clearance. But even that fragment was enough to send a subtle chill through his instincts, because advisory designations at that level were rarely assigned, and almost never to someone outside the active chain of command. Bennett exhaled slowly, closing the interface. Without drawing attention, as Captain Jason Mercer moved toward the center of the room, issuing final timing confirmations, "Transport wheels up in 20 minutes, Mercer said calmly, and the operators acknowledged with quiet nods. Carter remained still, observing the rhythm of the room with the same calm awareness that had defined his presence from the beginning. Colonel David Harrington stepped closer to Mercer, speaking quietly but clearly enough for Bennett to hear. "You will want Carter on comms advisory during approach," Harrington said, and Mercer hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not out of resistance, but surprise, because advisory roles during live operations were reserved for individuals with exceptional experience. Mercer nodded slowly. "Understood, sir," he replied, and Bennett noticed how Mercer's posture shifted again, the quiet acceptance of Carter's influence becoming more natural. Carter inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the decision without comment, and the subtle exchange settled into the room with quiet authority. Bennett moved away from the console, his attention returning fully to the unfolding preparations, but his mind lingered on the fragment of information he had seen, operational advisory designation. The words echoed quietly, shaping his understanding of the old man standing just a few feet away. Mercer stepped toward Carter, his voice calm but respectful. "We will route secondary comms through you during approach," he said, and Carter nodded once. "That will work," he replied, the certainty in his tone steady and unforced. Mercer gave a small nod, then turned back to the team, the final checklist progressing smoothly, equipment secured, timing synchronized, and yet the atmosphere remained subtly different, more grounded, as if Carter's presence had introduced an additional layer of experience into the room. Colonel Harrington watched the exchange quietly, his expression composed but observant, and Bennett noticed how even Harrington seemed to defer subtly to Carter's quiet awareness, not through rank, but through recognition. The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the operational display transitioned to departure mode, and Carter glanced once more toward the terrain overlay, his eyes tracing the valley and ridge lines with quiet familiarity. Then he gave another small nod, almost imperceptible, as if confirming a memory aligning with the present. Bennett felt the quiet gravity of that gesture, because it carried the weight of experience that could not be measured by data alone. Mercer gathered the final documents, then paused briefly, looking toward Carter once more, the respect now unmistakable, and as the room shifted toward departure, the old man's presence no longer felt unusual. It felt essential, like a quiet anchor guiding the flow of the mission without ever raising his voice. The operations room transitioned into departure readiness as the final timing markers appeared across the digital display, the soft glow of the map reflecting across the faces of the Delta operators while the low hum of systems filled the background. Captain Jason Mercer moved toward the communications station, verifying signal routing and secondary channels, and William Carter stepped closer to the display, his eyes tracing the terrain one more time, calm and deliberate, as if confirming something etched into memory rather than analyzing new information. Sergeant Luke Bennett watched quietly, the earlier fragment of restricted data still echoing in his thoughts, and he noticed how Carter's gaze paused briefly over the northern ridge before shifting toward the valley floor, the same subtle pattern from earlier, and that consistency reinforced the quiet respect growing among the team. Colonel David Harrington stepped beside Carter, his voice low and steady. "Transport will reach the ridge in 14 minutes, he said, and Carter nodded slightly, his expression unchanged. "Wind will shift 2 minutes earlier," Carter replied calmly, and Mercer glanced over from the communication station, adjusting the timing marker without hesitation, the change appearing silently on the screen, and the operators around the room absorbed the adjustment with disciplined acceptance. Because by now Carter's observations had earned quiet credibility, the overhead lights dimmed further as the display transitioned into live operational mode, terrain contours sharpening, wind projections updating in real time, and Carter leaned slightly forward, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the console, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if listening to something beyond the room. Mercer's voice carried across the space, "Primary team ready," he confirmed, and a series of quiet acknowledgements followed. Bennett moved toward the side display, monitoring signal clarity, while Carter's eyes shifted once more toward the valley, his voice calm but precise. "You will encounter a narrow band of crosswind just below the ridge," he said, and Mercer nodded immediately, adjusting the approach vector by a few degrees, the change subtle but meaningful. The operators noted the shift without question, and the atmosphere in the room grew more focused, the quiet collaboration between Carter and Mercer forming a steady rhythm. Colonel Harrington observed silently, his posture composed, yet Bennett noticed the faint respect in his expression deepen, because Carter's calm guidance had already shaped multiple operational decisions. The digital display updated again, showing transport nearing the designated approach zone, and Carter's gaze followed the movement, his eyes narrowing slightly as if recalling the terrain from another time. The faint sound of communications traffic filtered through the room, calm and professional, and Carter spoke once more, his voice steady. "Reduce speed by 5% approaching the valley floor." Mercer relayed the adjustment immediately, the change acknowledged over comms without hesitation, and Bennett felt the quiet realization settle fully now. Carter was not reacting to data, he was anticipating it, and that level of awareness carried a weight that no clearance badge could match. The display showed the approach continuing smoothly, and Mercer glanced briefly toward Carter, the respect now open and unmistakable. Carter gave a Small nod, then leaned back slightly, returning to his quiet composure. The room remained focused, the rhythm steady, and Bennett realized that the old man who had entered the room as an unknown presence had now become a silent guide shaping the mission's path, not through authority, but through experience. And as the transport icon moved deeper into the terrain display, Carter's calm presence anchored the room, steady and certain, like a voice remembered long before it was ever heard. The operations room held its breath as the transport icon moved steadily across the terrain display, the faint glow of the digital map reflecting across focused faces while quiet communication updates flowed through the speakers. Calm and measured, Captain Jason Mercer stood near the console, his posture steady, but his attention remained partially fixed on William Carter, whose calm presence had shaped each adjustment leading to this moment. Sergeant Luke Bennett monitored signal clarity, his eyes shifting between data streams and Carter's subtle expressions, and he noticed Carter's gaze settle once more on the valley floor, the same deliberate stillness returning as if the old man were listening to the terrain itself. Colonel David Harrington remained beside the display, arms folded behind his back, his expression composed but attentive. The transport indicator moved past the ridge line, and Carter spoke quietly. "Maintain current vector for another 30 seconds, his voice calm and precise. Mercer relayed the adjustment without hesitation, and the acknowledgement returned instantly. The icon continued forward, the wind overlay shifting slightly across the screen, and Bennett saw the predicted crosswind band appear exactly where Carter had indicated earlier, the timing aligning almost perfectly. Mercer glanced briefly toward Carter, the respect now unmistakable, and Carter gave a small nod, his expression unchanged. The display updated again, showing the transport clearing the narrowest portion of the valley, and the communications officer announced stable conditions. The room's tension eased slightly, but Carter remained focused, his eyes tracking the final approach zone. "You are clear," Carter said softly after a moment, and Mercer relayed the confirmation. The acknowledgement returned calm and steady. The icon reached the designated zone, and the system indicated successful arrival. A quiet exhale seemed to move across the room, subtle but shared. Mercer leaned back slightly, the mission phase complete, and for the first time since the briefing began, the atmosphere relaxed. Colonel Harrington turned toward Carter, the quiet respect in his posture now open and unmistakable. "Your timing remains precise," Harrington said quietly, and Carter gave a small nod. "Terrain remembers," he replied calmly. Mercer stepped closer, the professionalism in his voice steady but respectful. "Sir, I appreciate the guidance," he said, and Carter met his gaze briefly, the calm in his eyes unchanged. "You trusted the terrain," Carter replied, and Mercer nodded, understanding settling deeper. Bennett watched the exchange, the earlier fragment of restricted clearance now fully explained without words. The operators began resetting displays and closing systems, but the quiet respect toward Carter lingered, not spoken, but felt. Carter picked up the worn leather folder once more, holding it lightly as he turned toward the exit. Harrington stepped aside subtly, allowing him space, and as Carter moved toward the door, Mercer straightened instinctively, the gesture small but genuine. Bennett noticed the same quiet acknowledgement from several operators, not formal, not exaggerated, just a natural response to earned respect. Carter paused briefly at the doorway, glancing once more toward the terrain display, then gave a faint nod, as if confirming the memory had aligned with the present, and he stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind him. The room remained quiet for a moment afterward. Mercer looked toward